Yesterday we had Mary-Eileen Russell spoke about her book Trianon, and I was absolutely fascinated by what she had to say, and I'm looking forward very much to hearing the second of the two lectures on Madame Royale. And there's a very telling phrase or two in the introductory remarks about Mary-Eileen, and it's the last sentence that takes my attention. When people have a false and distorted view of history, then it's difficult for them to grasp the present and almost impossible to meet the future with any kind of preparedness. And it's precisely that, so far as the Catholic religion is concerned. If we have a false notion of where we came from and what we are all about, we really do miss the point of the whole exercise of being here where we are at the moment. So I'm looking forward to hearing again what Mary-Eileen Russell has to say to us. Will you please make her welcome?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say that it is a truly marvelous thing for me to have come to the other side of the world and to find brothers and sisters who share the same faith, the same traditions, the same values. And to me, that speaks of the beauty and the glory of our Holy Catholic faith, which is truly a universal faith. I've had some wonderful conversations with many of you since my talk yesterday and this morning. I've had some other wonderful conversations. I've gotten some excellent feedback from my talk yesterday. People have asked questions about certain points about my book and my writings. So I'm going to cover some of those first before I get into my original planned talk about Madame Royale. People have asked me how I came to be interested in Marie-Antoinette and Louis XVI. I read my first book about Marie-Antoinette when I was 9 years old. I was really fascinated with her whole story. She was a fairy tale princess, but the fairy tale was turned into a nightmare. But throughout her ordeals, she behaved with great courage and dignity, which showed that her personhood was not reliant upon the exterior trappings of royalty. Her dignity had its root elsewhere. So that was always stayed with me. When I was 17, I went with my high school to France, and not the entire school, but with the French class. We visited Versailles, the royal palace, and we went to Petit Trianon. Petit Trianon was the little house on the grounds of the palace where Marie-Antoinette would go to get away from the protocol of the court, the very stiff etiquette. She would go there with her children. She wanted her children to have a home life and not always be in the public gaze as they were at the royal court. And so I visited the gardens. It was in the dead of winter. The gardens of Trianon, there were no flowers growing. But I was struck by how, even though it was the dead of winter, it was bitter cold, the birds were singing as if it were spring. And there was a very special aura about the gardens of Marie-Antoinette. And I thought to myself, as a 17-year-old, I thought, well, she couldn't have been such a wicked person to have created such beautiful gardens. And that was the beginning of my research, which continued and still is continuing. I'm still researching, I'm still discovering more things about Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette. And the more I discover about them, I almost feel I didn't do them enough justice in my novel, Trianon. Some people have also asked me about the titles of my novels. Trianon, of course, I took the name from Marie-Antoinette's little house where she would go to be alone with her family. And that's because I wanted to show the royal family in their humanity as a family like other families. Now, Madame Royale is the title which was always given to the oldest daughter of the King of France. Madame Royale, in my novel, is Marie-Thérèse-Charlotte, the oldest daughter, the oldest child of Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette, and the only one of their immediate family who survived the revolution. People have also asked me about why I chose to write a novel rather than a serious biography. I chose to write a novel because, well, for one thing, there were several biographies in existence which I had a very high regard for, and I didn't want to just replicate those biographies. I wanted to write a novel because in a novel you can do a psychological study. You can get inside the person's head, you can look into their heart, you can explore deeper spiritual issues. And I really wanted to explore the spiritual warfare that was going on in society, in the hearts of the characters and in society at large. People have also asked me about my pen name. I write under the name of Elena Maria Vidal. Elena Maria Vidal, Elena Maria is my own name in Spanish, and Vidal was my grandmother's last name. My grandmother was Maria Magdalena Vidal. She was born in the Philippine Islands, and I was very close to her as a child. She used to tell me stories about her life. And through a series of misfortunes, my grandmother came to die and be buried in an unmarked grave. And so I wanted her name to be somewhere. So that is why I write using her last name, Vidal. Now, my novel, Madame Royale, was written at the request of people who read the first novel. They said they wanted a sequel. They wanted to know what happened to the daughter of Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette. And so I started doing the research, and I went ahead, wrote the novel. It was published during the Jubilee year 2000. It is dedicated to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. I once heard a priest say that the mystery of the Immaculate Heart of Mary is the mystery of the triumph of the mercy of God. Our Lady remained on earth after her Son went to heaven to help establish the Church. It is a mystery of the mother who suffers for her children. This mystery was lived out by Marie-Thérèse of France in what she suffered for her country and made reparation to bring salvific graces to the people of France after what they had been through in the revolution and the great loss of faith and the great apostasy from the faith and from the Church. The center of the book, the pivotal moment in the novel Madame Royale, are the apparitions at the Rue de Bac in 1830. So I was very delighted when Dr. Mark discussed those yesterday. If you read my book, Madame Royale, and you read about the apparitions, please keep in mind what Dr. Mark said about Our Lady as co-redemptrix. Those apparitions in 1830 were a pivotal moment for the world, a moment of challenge and decision. The mother intercedes at the foot of the cross. And Marie-Thérèse was almost like at the foot of the cross, because she saw her family die. And as Our Lady's heart was mystically pierced, Marie-Thérèse of France had to live on without her family. She had to bear a lifelong sorrow. She had to bear the traumas of the revolution, of seeing people killed, of hearing her parents mocked and ridiculed, of having her brother tortured and destroyed. So part of the reason I wrote this book is I wanted to explore, how does someone live with a lifelong sorrow? How does someone go on when they have traumas, emotional traumas that will never fully be healed in this world? Of course, the life of Marie-Thérèse-Charlotte began in great splendor. She was the oldest daughter of Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette. She was born in public. In those days, the queen had to give birth to her children in public to make sure, so everyone, because the children of the king and queen belonged to all the people of France. The people don't realize this, but the royal palace itself, the Palace of Versailles, was open to the public. Anyone could go into the palace and watch the royal family during the course of their day. All you had to do, gentlemen had to wear a sword, ladies had to wear a hoop skirt. Those could be rented at the palace gates. So you had all kinds of people in the palace. People would come up from Paris. People would set up little shops in the corridors of the palace. They would sell, ribbons and perfume, and there would be beggars who would sneak in somehow. And so the palace, it wasn't just for the king and queen and the royal family. It belonged to all the people. It was actually very democratic, and much more democratic in some ways than the White House and places where heads of state now reside. Another theme in this book is the suffering of the innocent. And that's actually a theme in both books, because the Trianon begins with the image of the Christ child, and it ends, Madame Royale ends with the image of the Christ child, because I wanted to explore the suffering of the innocent, especially through little children who must suffer. The Dauphin, the son of Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette, as we discussed yesterday, suffered terribly in prison. And Marie-Thérèse-Charlotte, who had to go on living after everyone else she loved had died, had to suffer a great deal as a teenager in prison. She was in solitary confinement for over a year, alone in the Temple Tower prison, and we aren't really completely sure what happened to her there, because she was alone and unprotected, and the guards could be very rude. And so she was told by her aunt, before her aunt was killed, her aunt told her never to be found by the guards lying down in bed. So often Marie-Thérèse would sit all night in a chair, very terrified that someone was going to burst in upon her and do her harm. But I also want to talk about that it was not only the children of Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette who suffered. There were many other children in France who suffered terribly during the French Revolution. The Vendée was an area of France which was very devoutly Catholic. The people of the Vendée, the peasants there, did not accept the revolution. They rebelled against it, and they started to fight for the king and the queen, even though the king and queen had been killed, but they continued to fight for the little Louis XVII who was in prison. The revolutionary forces came to the Vendée and ruthlessly put down the rebellion of the peasants, and they said it was one of the first of the modern atrocities upon civilians, whereas many women and children were horribly killed, not just killed, but were tortured and just brutalized in many terrible ways. So all of France suffered. It wasn't just the children of Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette. But before that terrible time of suffering, Marie-Thérèse had a very happy childhood. There is a famous painting by Madame Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun of the Queen, Marie-Antoinette, with her children. And nearby is a jewel cabinet, but the Queen is not wearing very many jewels. That is because the painting was to emphasize that for the Queen, her children were her true jewels. They were her true wealth. They mattered more than any material, diamonds or pearls. Now, Marie-Antoinette, her oldest son, died right as the revolution was starting in 1789. And so Marie-Antoinette had the painting hidden away. The youngest daughter, baby Sophie, also died, which is why the cradle was shown in the painting covered with black crepe. Marie-Thérèse-Charlotte always had a view of, had earthly things and put in a certain perspective, even while she was living in splendor in Versailles, because her parents, as I've said before, had extensive charities, which they encouraged Marie-Thérèse to participate in. The king and queen were patrons of the Maison Philanthropique, a society which helped the aged, the blind, and the widows. The queen taught her daughter, Madame Royale, to wait upon peasant children and to sacrifice her Christmas gifts so as to buy fuel and blankets for the destitute. They would bring baskets of food to the sick and the poor. They were sponsors of several foundling hospitals where little orphan children and orphan babies would be taken. And they would visit, Marie-Antoinette would take her children to visit the little babies. And the little Dauphin, Louis Charles, was quite concerned about the babies and asked if he could donate some of his own little pocket money from his piggy bank, and not that he would have had that, but whatever little money he was saving, he would give it to the little children, not knowing that he himself was very soon to be an orphan. Now, Marie-Antoinette also adopted 3 poor children to be raised with her own. And there were other children she wanted to adopt. She couldn't adopt all the children she saw, so she would provide for the upbringing of several needy children. She would provide for their families. She paid for the education of several children. There were children who were talented, who had showed musical ability. Marie-Antoinette would pay for their music lessons. Now, the reason I'm going over this is that her daughter, Madame Royale, continued the same tradition on into the 1830s, 1840s for the rest of her life. She was very charitable. Now, in spite of what Marie-Thérèse-Charlotte suffered during the Revolution, she had a great love of France. In 1851, the year she died, Marie-Thérèse-Charlotte was visited at her villa in Austria, where she was living in exile, by the Comte de Fouillou. The Count described the aged daughter of Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette as follows. He said, "Madame la Dauphine was, if I may express it, pathos in person. Sadness was imprinted on her features and revealed in her attitude, but in the same degree there shone about her an unalterable resignation, an unalterable gentleness. Even when the tones of her voice were brusque, which often happened, the kindness of her intention remained transparent. She liked to pass in review the Frenchmen she had known. She kept herself closely informed about their family events. She remembered the slightest details with rare fidelity. 'How Madame loves France,' I said to her one day. 'That is not surprising,' she replied. 'I take it from my parents.'" So she was always taught to love her country, not to blame the French people for what had happened and for her parents' death. She always loved her country and believed in its destiny. Now, Marie-Thérèse had terrible afflictions in prison. Her brother was being tormented in the rooms below. Marie-Thérèse was not allowed to see him at all. Even when he died or was sick and dying, she could not go take care of him. She was not allowed to pray by his body after he died. And part of this is what gave rumor to the legend that, well, it was more than a legend, to the rumors that the Dauphin had escaped and had been exchanged with another boy, because it was very strange that they did not allow Marie-Thérèse to see her brother. I go into this mystery in my novel, Madame Royale. I know that now they've done DNA tests on the heart that they think belonged to the Dauphin, and that heart proved that whoever it belonged to was a child of a Habsburg princess. So it could be the little boy. Very probably, it's 99.9% certain that he did die in prison. However, in those days, they had no DNA. They didn't have his body. No one knew where he was buried. So that's why there were many rumors. And it gave rise to many pretenders coming forth. And Marie-Thérèse had to deal with all these people who would come and say, I'm your brother. Though I go into that in my novel. Now, one thing I wanted to emphasize is that the French Revolution put into motion a series of revolutions, a series of political upheavals, most of them were, but it also eventually led to the cultural revolutions of our own century. And all of this was to bring about an increasing secularization of society, so that now we have, Christian society is being attacked on every level. There are attacks on family life, there are attacks on life itself. There are every kind of immoral agenda is being put forward. Well, I think it's important for people to realize where all this came from. This didn't happen overnight. It started with the French Revolution, and it gradually increased. Now, Marie-Thérèse, when she came back to France, when the monarchy was restored in 1815, they were thrown out again in 1830. Marie-Thérèse was an instrument of the divine mercy and restored the church in France. Now, in that century, the church in France would give us many great saints: Saint Bernadette, Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, Blessed Charles of Jesus, Blessed Elizabeth of the Trinity, Saint John Vianney, Saint Catherine Labouré. So there were many, many wonderful things that came after her short time back in France. Now, the Bourbons were thrown out again in 1830. I want to quote from Father Joseph Dervin's book on St. Catherine Labouré, which I covered this in the novel, that we know about the apparitions of Our Lady. Many people don't realize that St. Catherine Labouré, on June 6, 1830, received a vision of Christ the King. And this heralded to her that the king that would fall. And that would be the end, really, of France having a Christian society. Christianity was being eroded away there. And so that was the beginning of the trials, of the culmination of the revolution. So on Trinity Sunday, June 6, 1830, Sister Catherine Labouré was given a special vision of Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, or more specifically, of Christ the King. She was very precise as to the time of the vision. Our Lord appeared to her, robed as a king, with a cross at his breast, during the Gospel of the Mass. Suddenly, all his kingly ornaments fell from him to the ground, even the cross, which tumbled beneath his feet. Immediately, her thoughts and her heart fell too, and were plunged into that chasm of gloom that she had known before, gloom that portended a change in government. This time, however, she understood clearly that the change in government involved the person of the king, and that just as Christ was divested of his royal trappings before her, so would Charles X be divested of his throne. That was the end of the Bourbon monarchy, the traditional monarchy in France. And the revolution, in many ways, has never ended. The monarchies of old Europe were replaced by the dictatorship of Napoleon, and later by fascism and communism. Now, we all know when the state becomes a god, it is a false god, and every false god is a demon. We live in times in which Christ the King has been roundly rejected in public life. In my novels, I try to trace out where we came to be where we are now, how we came to be here. There are turning points in history. Are we approaching another turning point, another moment of decision in which God will reign over our hearts, or whether the anti-Christian forces will triumph? It is at his feet that we find discernment and hope, at the throne of judgment and mercy, asking mercy for our age. Thank you very much.